The Vikings conquered England. They conquered Ireland. They conquered parts of France, Russia, and Sicily. They were the most feared warriors in the medieval world, unstoppable, relentless, masters of warfare. But in the year 1009, on the shores of what we now call Newfoundland, they met their match. The Beothuk didn't just defeat the Vikings, they erased them, drove them back across the Atlantic so completely that for the next 500 years, most Europeans thought the Viking stories about reaching North America were just myths. This is the story of the only place the Vikings tried to colonize and failed. To understand what happened in Vinland, you first need to understand what kind of people the Vikings were in the year 1000 AD. This is peak Viking age. For 2 centuries, Norse raiders have been terrorizing Europe. They've sacked monasteries in England, conquered parts of France, established kingdoms in Ireland, and sailed as far as Constantinople. They're the most technologically advanced mariners of their time, and they know it. But here's the thing people often miss about the Vikings. By the year 1000, they're not just raiders anymore. They're settlers, colonizers. They've learned that you can't just pillage a place. You have to control it, populate it, make it yours. This mindset is why, when Leif Erikson accidentally discovers a landmass west of Greenland around the year 1000, the Norse don't just explore it and leave. They see opportunity. They see resources. They see territory. Leif names the place Vinland, Wineland, because of the wild grapes growing there. He spends one winter, then returns to Greenland with stories of endless timber, abundant wildlife, and mild weather. For the Norse colonists of Greenland, who live on a barren, treeless island where every piece of wood has to be imported, Vinland sounds like paradise. 3 separate expeditions are launched over the next decade. The first 2 are exploratory, quick trips to confirm Leif's claims. But the 3rd expedition, led by a wealthy Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni, is different. Thorfinn doesn't come to explore, he comes to stay. In the spring of 1007, Thorfinn Karlsefni assembles the most ambitious Viking colonization attempt in history. He recruits 60 men and 5 women, farmers, craftsmen, warriors, all willing to leave Greenland for a chance at prosperity in this new land. They bring livestock, cattle, sheep, even a bull. They bring seeds for planting, tools for building, weapons for defending. They bring everything they need to establish a permanent Norse settlement in North America. The journey takes weeks, 3 ships sailing southwest from Greenland, following the route Leif Erikson pioneered. They navigate by the sun and stars, by the flight patterns of birds, by the color of the water. When they finally reach the coast of what we now know is Newfoundland, Thorfinn chooses a site for their settlement. A protected bay with a river running into it, forests nearby, open land for grazing. The Norse call it Straumfjörður, stream fjord. Today we call it Lons o Meadows, the only confirmed Viking settlement in North America. They build quickly, timber-framed houses with sod roofs modelled after the longhouses back in Iceland, a forge for metalworking, storage buildings for supplies. They clear land for farming, put the livestock out to pasture, and establish a perimeter. Within months, Straumfjörður looks like a functioning Norse village. Thorfinn feels confident. His people are skilled. His defences are solid. He's done this before, established outposts in hostile territory, dealt with indigenous populations. But Thorfinn Karlsefni has never encountered people like the Beothuk. The Norse sagas, The written records that tell us about these expeditions call them Skraelings. It's a derogatory term, roughly translating to wretches or screechers. The Norse use it for any indigenous people they encounter, whether they're Beothuk, Inuit, or Mi'kmaq. The sagas don't differentiate much. But we know now that the people the Norse encountered at Lance o' Meadows were almost certainly Beothuk, a distinct indigenous group native to Newfoundland, with their own language, culture, and territorial claims. And they're immediately suspicious of these pale-skinned strangers building permanent structures on their land. The first contact happens in the fall of 1007, about 6 months after the Norse arrive. A group of 9 Beothuk appears at the edge of the settlement. The sagas describe them as carrying skin boats, kayaks, over their heads. They're cautious, observing from a distance. Thorfinn, ever the diplomat, orders his men to lower their weapons. He walks out to meet them, hands open, showing he's unarmed. He offers gifts, cloth, metal tools, things he assumes will appeal to a primitive people. The Beothuk accept the gifts. They examine the metal tools with what Thorfinn interprets as wonder. They gesture toward the forest, seeming to indicate they'll return. Thorfinn returns to the settlement confident he's established peaceful relations. He's completely misread the situation. Here's what Thorfinn doesn't understand. The Beothuk aren't impressed by the Norse technology. They're assessing it. They're not awed by the metal weapons and tools. They're calculating how to neutralize them. They're not intimidated by the wooden buildings. They're noting the construction, the layout, the weak points. The Beothuk have been living in Newfoundland for at least 2,000 years by this point. They know this land intimately. Every forest path, every river crossing, every hunting ground. They're expert hunters, skilled boatmen, and masters of guerrilla warfare. They've fought off rival tribes before, they've defended their territory countless times, and they're looking at this Norse settlement not as an opportunity for trade, but as an invasion. The Beothuk strategy is brilliant in its simplicity. Don't engage the Vikings directly. Don't give them a pitched battle where their superior armor and weapons can dominate. Instead, make the land itself hostile. Make every day in Vinland exhausting, dangerous, unpredictable. Make the Norse want to leave. Over the winter of 1007 to 1008, the attacks begin. It starts small. A cow goes missing from the pasture. The Norse assume wolves, though they haven't seen any. Then a storage shed is found broken into, supplies scattered. Then a fisherman working alone by the river doesn't come back. His body is found 3 days later, half a mile downstream. The Norse strengthen their defences. They build a palisade around the settlement. They post guards at night. They organise patrols into the surrounding forest. But the Beothuk are never where the Norse expect them to be. In March of 1008, a Norse hunting party of 5 men ventures 2 miles inland, tracking deer. They're experienced warriors, all of them. They're armed, alert, following proper formation. But somewhere in those trees, the Beothuk are watching, waiting. Only 2 of the Norse hunters make it back. They're bleeding, exhausted, traumatized. They tell Thorfinn the same thing. The attack came from nowhere. Arrows from the tree line. By the time they could react, 3 men were down. They retreated and the arrows stopped. The Beothuk didn't pursue, didn't even show themselves. Thorfinn recognizes what's happening. This isn't a war, it's a campaign of attrition. The Beothuk are bleeding his settlement slowly, picking off anyone who ventures too far from the main compound. They're trying to trap the Norse inside their own walls, make them too afraid to hunt, fish, or gather resources. It's working. By the summer of 1008, the Norse are confined to their settlement. They're running low on food. The livestock they brought are dying, some from disease, some from mysterious nighttime attacks. Morale is collapsing. People are terrified. Several settlers approach Thorfinn and demand they abandon Vinland and return to Greenland. Thorfinn refuses. He's invested too much. He's a proud man, a successful explorer, and he's not going to let a group of primitives drive him off land he's claimed for the Norse. But that pride is about to cost him everything. The decisive moment comes in the fall of 1008. The Norse haven't had a major confrontation with the Beothuk yet, just these hit-and-run attacks, these ambushes. Thorfinn decides he needs to change the dynamic. He needs to take the fight to the enemy. He organizes a large war party, 30 men, over half his fighting force. They're going to march inland, find a Beothuk camp and deliver a crushing blow that will establish Norse dominance once and for all. The sagas describe this expedition in detail, which tells you how significant it was. Thorfinn leads the party himself. They march for 2 days deep into the interior of Newfoundland, following trails the Beothuk have left. It feels almost too easy, like the Beothuk want to be followed. On the 3rd day they find the camp, a small cluster of shelters near a river, smoke from cooking fires rising into the air. Thorfinn counts maybe 20 Beothuk, men, women, children. He's brought 30 armed warriors. This should be a massacre. He orders the attack. The Norse charge into the camp, axes and swords raised. They're screaming their war cries, expecting terror, expecting surrender. But instead they hear something that stops them cold. Laughter. And then from every direction, from the trees, from the river, from behind rocks and fallen logs, the Beothuk attack. There weren't 20 Beothuk in that camp. There were 200 hiding in the forest, waiting for this exact moment. The camp was bait. The trails were bait. The entire 2-day march was the Beothuk leading Thorfinn exactly where they wanted him. The ambush is devastating. Arrows rain down from the tree line. Beothuk warriors rush from concealment, wielding clubs and stone-tipped lances. The Norse are surrounded, outnumbered, caught completely off guard. Their heavy armor, such an advantage in European warfare, becomes a liability in this dense forest terrain. They can't maneuver, can't retreat, can't even see where the attacks are coming from. Thorfinn makes the only decision he can. Full retreat. He screams for his men to run, to break through the encirclement and get back to the coast. It's chaos. Men are falling all around him. He can hear his warriors crying out in Norse, in pain, in panic. He runs. By the time the survivors stumble back to Straumfjörður 3 days later, Thorfinn has lost 14 men, nearly half his war party. Several more are wounded badly enough they'll never fight again. The psychological damage is even worse. These are Viking warriors, men who've raided across Europe, who fear no enemy, and they've just been routed by an indigenous force they completely underestimated. The defeat is total. The myth of Norse invincibility, at least in this land, is shattered. That night, sitting in his longhouse, Thorfinn Karlsefni makes a decision he never thought he'd have to make. They're leaving Vinland. The evacuation happens quickly. Within 2 weeks, the Norse have packed everything they can carry, loaded it onto their ships, and prepared to sail back to Greenland. They're abandoning the settlement they spent 2 years building, The fields they cleared, the structures they razed, everything. Some settlers argue they should stay. They've survived the winter. They have defences. Maybe if they just hold out, the Beothuk will lose interest. But Thorfinn knows better. He's seen what the Beothuk can do. He's watched them adapt, strategize, dominate terrain the Norse will never understand, as well as they do. Every day in Vinland is a day the Beothuk can choose to attack. And eventually, the Norse will make a mistake, and everyone will die. So they leave. In the autumn of 1009, less than 3 years after they arrived with dreams of establishing the first permanent Norse colony in North America, Thorfinn Karlsefni orders the ships loaded and sails back to Greenland in defeat. Music, somber, reflective. The sagas try to spin the departure as dignified, a strategic withdrawal, a recognition that Vinland is too distant to support regular contact with Greenland. But the truth is there in the text if you read carefully. The Norse didn't leave because of distance. They left because the Beothuk made it impossible to stay. They left because they were beaten. When Thorfinn's ships arrived back in Greenland in late 1009, the colonists there are shocked. They'd expected Thorfinn to return with reports of a thriving settlement, maybe even requesting additional settlers. Instead, he comes back with a battered, traumatized group of survivors and stories of constant attacks by hostile natives. The message is clear. Vinland is not worth the cost. Over the next few years, there are discussions about attempting another expedition, mounting a larger military force, establishing a fortified base that could withstand Beothuk attacks. But nothing comes of it. The Norse are pragmatic people. They don't throw good money after bad. If a colony isn't sustainable, you abandon it. And so Vinland fades from Norse ambitions. There's one more recorded attempt, a small expedition in 1014, led by Freydis Eiriksdottir, Leif Eriksson's sister. The saga about this voyage is dark, full of betrayal and violence, even among the Norse themselves. Freydis apparently murders several members of her own party in a dispute over resources. The expedition is a disaster, and when the survivors return to Greenland, the settlement at Vinland is definitively abandoned. No Norse expedition ever returns to North America. By 1020, Straumfjörður, Lance o' Meadows, is empty. The Beothuk move in, examining the strange structures the foreigners left behind. They salvage the metal objects, which they find useful. They burn the rest, reclaiming their land. Within a generation, the Norse settlement is gone, reclaimed by the forest. Within a century, even the memory of Vinland begins to fade from Norse consciousness. The sagas preserve the stories, but they're treated increasingly as legends. Tales of a mysterious western land that might not even be real. For nearly 1,000 years, the story of the Viking attempt to colonize North America is forgotten by everyone except the people who defeated them. Let's jump forward now. Way forward. To 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, are searching the coast of Newfoundland, trying to confirm whether the Viking sagas about Vinland are based in reality. Most historians at this point believe Vinland is either mythological or misidentified. Maybe the Vikings reached Greenland's southern tip and got confused. The idea that they reached North America is considered fringe theory, but the Ingstads are convinced. They've studied the sagas carefully. They've mapped out the descriptions of Vinland's geography. And in 1960, in a remote location on Newfoundland's northern peninsula, they find something that changes history. They find Lance O Meadows. At first, it doesn't look like much, just some grass-covered mounds near a river. But when they start excavating, they find unmistakable evidence of Norse habitation. Timber-framed buildings, a forge for metalworking, a workshop for woodworking. Artifacts that are clearly Norse in origin, including a bronze pin identical to ones found in Iceland and Greenland. The site is authenticated, dated, confirmed. This is it. This is Straumfjörður. This is the settlement Thorfinn Karlsefni, built in 1007 and abandoned in 1009. This is proof that Vikings reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus, that they attempted colonization, that the sagas were telling the truth. It's one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. But here's what's fascinating. The site also confirms why the Norse failed. The settlement is small, clearly intended for maybe 70 to 90 people maximum. The buildings are temporary structures, not the kind of permanent construction you'd expect if the Norse planned to stay for generations. Most tellingly, there's evidence of hasty abandonment. Artifacts left behind that should have been taken, buildings that were never finished. And around the site, archaeologists find something else, evidence of fire damage that doesn't match accidental burns. Scorched timber, deliberately destroyed structures. The Beothuk were here after the Norse left, and they made sure nothing remained. Now, let's talk about the people who actually won this conflict, because the Beothuk side of this story is even more remarkable than the Norse side. The Beothuk in the year 1000 are a sophisticated, well-organized society. They live in small mobile groups that move seasonally, inland during winter, to the coast during summer. They're master hunters, expert at taking caribou, seals, and fish. They're skilled craftsmen, creating tools from stone, bone, and wood. They navigate Newfoundland's rivers and coastline in remarkable bark canoes. And most importantly for our story, they're fierce defenders of their territory. When the Norse arrive in 1007, the Beothuk recognize these immediately. What's happening? These aren't traders passing through. These aren't temporary visitors. These are settlers, people building permanent structures, clearing land, bringing livestock, people who intend to stay. The Beothuk have a choice: accept this invasion or resist it. They choose resistance. And their strategy is brilliant. The Beothuk don't try to match the Norse in conventional warfare. They don't line up for pitched battles where Norse armor and weapons would dominate. Instead, they use their advantages, knowledge of the terrain, mobility, numbers, to wage what we'd now call guerrilla warfare. They attack the Norse supply lines. They ambush isolated groups. They create an environment where the Norse can never feel safe, never fully relax, never establish the security they need for a colony to thrive. And crucially, they escalate gradually. They start with small harassment, then increase pressure, then deliver a devastating ambush that breaks Norse morale completely. By the time Thorfinn Karlsefni realizes how outmatched he is, it's too late to adapt. The Beothuk victory at Vinland is one of the most successful indigenous resistance campaigns in history. They don't just defeat a Viking expedition, they defeat the concept of Norse colonization in North America. They make the cost so high that the Norse never seriously try again. It's a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, executed perfectly. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Because the Beothuk's victory in 1009 doesn't protect them forever. When European colonization of North America resumes in the 1500s, this time with Spanish, English, and French expeditions, the Beothuk try the same strategies that worked against the Vikings. They harass settlements, they ambush colonists, they make it clear that Newfoundland is their land, and newcomers are not welcome. But 16th century Europeans are not 11th century Vikings. They have guns, they have diseases, they have an explicit policy of extermination if natives resist colonization. And most devastatingly, they keep coming. Wave after wave after wave, too many to drive off, too numerous to defeat. The Beothuk population in 1500 is estimated at around 2,000. By 1600, after a century of European contact, it's down to maybe 500. By 1700, fewer than 200. By 1800, fewer than 50. In 1829, a Beothuk woman named Shanodithit dies of tuberculosis in St. John's, Newfoundland. She is the last known full-blooded Beothuk. The people who defeated the Vikings, who defended their homeland so successfully that the most feared warriors in medieval Europe gave up and went home, are erased from history by later colonizers who learned from the Vikings' mistakes. It's one of history's cruelest ironies. Let's circle back to those Norse sagas for a moment, because they're fascinating documents, but they're also propaganda. The two main sagas that describe the Vinland voyages, the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, were written down in the 1200s, more than 200 years after the events they describe. They're not contemporary accounts. They're stories passed down orally, shaped by cultural biases, edited by Christian scribes who had their own agendas. And they absolutely try to downplay the Norse defeat. The sagas present the Skraelings, the Beothuk, as primitive, almost subhuman. They emphasize their strangeness, their lack of metal tools, their ugly appearance. They describe Beothuk attacks as chaotic and irrational, rather than strategic and coordinated. They frame the Norse abandonment of Vinland as a dignified choice, not a forced retreat. But if you read carefully, the truth is there. The sagas admit the Norse lost men in every encounter with the Beothuk. They admit the colonists were terrified. They admit Thorfinn Karlsefni, one of the most successful Norse explorers of his era, concluded that Vinland was too dangerous to inhabit. They admit the Norse never returned. Those are not the hallmarks of a successful colonial venture. Those are the hallmarks of defeat. Modern historians, reading the sagas alongside the archaeological evidence, have reconstructed what probably happened. The Beothuk recognized the Norse as an existential threat, mobilized a large defensive force, and systematically made it impossible for the Vikings to stay. The Norse, facing constant losses and unable to establish security, abandoned their settlement after less than 3 years. It's a David versus Goliath story, except David actually wins. To really appreciate how complete the Norse failure in Vinland was, it helps to compare it to their successes elsewhere. In Iceland, the Norse established a permanent colony starting in 874 AD. Within a few decades, they've got a functioning government, a growing population, sustainable agriculture. By the year 1000, Iceland has 60,000 Norse inhabitants and is fully integrated into the Norse world. In Greenland, Eric the Red establishes a colony in 985 AD. It's harsh, the climate is brutal, resources are limited. But the Norse make it work. At its peak, Greenland has 2 settlements, with a combined population of around 5,000. It lasts for over 400 years before finally collapsing in the 1400s. Even in hostile territories in Europe, Ireland, England, France, the Norse managed to establish lasting presences. Dublin, one of Ireland's major cities, was founded by Vikings. Normandy in France is literally named after the Northmen who conquered it. The Vikings are good at colonization. They're experienced, adaptable, and ruthless when necessary. But in Vinland, they last less than 3 years. Why? What made Newfoundland different? The answer is the Beothuk. In Iceland and Greenland, there are no indigenous populations to resist. In Europe, the Norse face resistance, but they have advantages: better weapons, defensive positions, reinforcements from Scandinavia. But in Vinland, they face an indigenous force that's mobile, numerous, intimately familiar with the terrain, and absolutely committed to driving them out. The Norse simply can't overcome that combination. Vinland is the only place the Vikings try to colonize and fail completely. And that failure shapes history. If the Norse had succeeded in establishing a permanent presence in North America in 1007, the entire trajectory of European colonization could have been different. The story of the Americas could have unfolded 500 years earlier. But because the Beothuk refused to be conquered, that didn't happen. Zooming out even further, the Beothuk victory at Vinland fits into a much larger pattern of indigenous resistance to European colonization, one that often gets erased from popular narratives. We tend to tell the story of European colonization in the Americas as inevitable, as if once Columbus arrived in 1492, indigenous peoples' defeat was predetermined, as if superior technology and diseases made European victory a foregone conclusion. But that's not how it happened. Indigenous peoples across the Americas resisted European colonization fiercely, and often successfully, for centuries. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 drove Spanish colonizers out of New Mexico for 12 years. The Mapuche in Chile fought Spanish colonization to a standstill for 300 years. The Lakota and Comanche dominated the Great Plains well into the 1800s. And the Beothuk drove the Vikings completely out of North America in 1009. Indigenous defeat in the Americas wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific historical circumstances: massive population, collapse from diseases, overwhelming numerical superiority as European immigration increased, technological advantages that widened over time, political divisions among indigenous groups that Europeans exploited. But none of those factors were present in 1009. The Beothuk had the numbers. The Norse had no way to reinforce their settlement quickly. Disease hadn't yet become a factor, and the Beothuk were unified in their opposition to Norse presence. So the Beothuk won. It's a reminder that history could have gone differently, that colonization was never inevitable, that indigenous peoples were never passive victims. They were active agents, fighting for their land and their survival. And sometimes they won. There's another important lesson in the Vinland story, one that challenges a lot of popular assumptions about the Vikings. In modern popular culture, Vikings are portrayed as unstoppable warriors. They're the heroes of TV shows, movies, video games. They're presented as conquerors who dominated everyone they encountered through sheer martial prowess and tactical brilliance. And sure, the Vikings were formidable. They did conquer large swaths of Europe. They were innovative sailors, fierce fighters, and effective raiders. But Vinland shows us their limits. When the Vikings encountered an enemy who fought on their own terms, on their own land, with their own strategies, they lost. The Beothuk didn't try to out-Viking the Vikings. They didn't engage in the kind of warfare the Norse excelled at. They fought smart, using the advantages they had, refusing to play the game on Norse terms. And it worked. The Vinland failure should be part of every conversation about the Vikings, because it complicates the narrative. It shows us that Viking success in Europe was due as much to circumstances, disorganized resistance, divided kingdoms, opportunities for raiding, as to inherent superiority. Put the Vikings in a different context, against a united, determined indigenous force fighting on familiar terrain, and they fail. That's a humbling lesson, and one that 11th century Norse chroniclers tried very hard to obscure. When the Ingstads discovered Lance aux Meadows in 1960, it caused a sensation. Finally, proof that the sagas were real. Finally, evidence that Europeans reached North America before Columbus. But in the initial excitement, one aspect of the story got overlooked: the indigenous perspective. Early interpretations of Lance aux Meadows focused almost entirely on the Norse, what they built, what they achieved, why they left. The Beothuk were mentioned, if at all, as a footnote. Hostile natives who made things difficult. It took decades for historians and archaeologists to reframe the narrative, to recognize that Vinland isn't primarily a story about Viking exploration. It's a story about indigenous resistance. That the real historical significance of Lance aux Meadows isn't that the Norse reached North America, but that they failed to stay. Modern interpretations of the site now emphasize the Beothuk's role. Museums in Newfoundland present Lance aux Meadows as a story of successful indigenous defense. Educational materials highlight Beothuk military tactics and strategic thinking. The narrative has shifted from Vikings discover America to indigenous peoples successfully defend their land. It's a small but important correction, one that gives credit where it's due, because for 1,000 years, the story of Vinland was told from the Norse perspective. The sagas presented it as a tale of exploration and adventure, with indigenous peoples as obstacles. But the real story, the one the archaeological evidence tells, is different. It's the story of the Beothuk winning. Before we close, let's engage in a little historical speculation. What if the Beothuk hadn't been able to drive the Norse out? What if Vinland had survived as a permanent Norse colony? It's fascinating to imagine. A Norse Newfoundland in 1100, maybe growing to a few thousand people by 1200, establishing trade routes with Greenland and Iceland, slowly expanding along the North American coast. Would they have encountered other indigenous groups? Absolutely. Would there have been conflicts? Almost certainly. But the Norse would have had a foothold, a base from which to operate. By the time Columbus arrives, in 1492, would there be Norse colonies all along the eastern seaboard of North America? Maybe. Would the history of European colonization be completely different? Probably. Or maybe not. Maybe the Norse colonies would have collapsed anyway, like the Greenland colonies did in the 1400s. Maybe they would have been absorbed into indigenous societies. Maybe they would have faced the same disease-driven population collapse that devastated indigenous peoples after 1492. We'll never know. But here's what we do know. The Beothuk's victory in 1009 meant that when European colonization of the Americas did begin in earnest in the 1500s, It happened on a completely different timeline. 500 more years of independent indigenous development. 500 more years of cultural flourishing, political evolution, and technological advancement. The Beothuk couldn't stop colonization forever. No one could. But they delayed it by half a millennium. That matters, so let's bring this home. What's the lasting legacy of the Vinland colony? What does this story mean? Thorfinn Karlsefni returns to Iceland after his failed Vinland expedition and lives for another 30 years. He has children, becomes a respected figure, and eventually dies of old age around 1039. His descendants become prominent Icelanders. The sagas treat him as a hero, but he never attempts another voyage to Vinland, never tries to redeem his failure. He knows what happened there, knows he was outmatched, outmaneuvered, defeated, and he lives with that knowledge until he dies. The Norse make no further attempts to colonize North America. Within a few generations, Vinland becomes a legend, a place that might have existed, or might have been exaggerated, or might have been entirely mythical. The story survives, but barely. Meanwhile, the Beothuk continue living in Newfoundland, hunting and fishing and travelling their seasonal routes. For them, the Norse incursion is probably remembered in their oral histories, a time when strange foreigners tried to take their land and were driven off, a reminder that their territory must be defended. They defend it successfully for another 500 years, but ultimately they can't hold out forever. When the next wave of colonization comes, in the 1500s and 1600s, the Beothuk fight just as fiercely as they did against the Vikings. But this time, the enemy keeps coming, and by 1829, the Beothuk are gone. Here's the brutal irony. The Beothuk defeated the Vikings so completely that their victory was forgotten. The sagas barely mention them. Medieval Europeans didn't even know the Beothuk existed. When later colonizers arrived in Newfoundland, they had no idea that this land had already once repelled a European invasion. The Beothuk won the battle but lost the war. And then they lost the memory of the battle too. But now we know, thanks to archaeology, thanks to careful saga analysis, thanks to modern historians willing to centre Indigenous perspectives. We know what happened at Lance Meadows in 1009. We know that the most feared warriors of medieval Europe came to North America with plans to conquer and colonize. We know they built their settlement, cleared their fields, and prepared to stay forever. And we know that the Beothuk said no, not with words, not with treaties, but with arrows, with ambushes, with a relentless campaign that made every single day in Vinland a gamble with death. They made the cost of staying higher than the benefit of remaining. They turned paradise into a nightmare. They taught the Vikings a lesson that no European army had managed to teach them. That discovery means nothing if the people who already live there refuse to be conquered. There's something poetic about the fact that for nearly 1,000 years, the only evidence of the Norse attempt to colonize North America was a few obscure passages in medieval sagas that most people assumed were fiction. The Vikings, who wrote everything down, who preserved their history meticulously, couldn't even bring themselves to be honest about what happened at Vinland. They were beaten, badly, completely, and it was so humiliating that they buried the story. But the land remembered. The archaeological evidence at Lance Meadows tells the truth the sagas tried to hide. The hasty abandonment, the unfinished buildings, the scorched timber, the evidence of a settlement that lasted barely long enough to establish itself before its occupants fled in defeat. Today, Lonzo Meadows is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Thousands of tourists visit every year. They walk through reconstructed Viking longhouses, handle replica tools, and learn about Norse exploration of North America. But the most important story that site tells isn't about Viking courage or adventurousness. It's about Indigenous resistance and resilience. It's about a people who looked at an invasion force and decided, not here, not now, not ever. The Beothuk are gone now, victims of a later colonization they couldn't stop. But their victory at Vinland remains, carved into the land itself, written in the archaeological record, preserved in the silence of the sagas that couldn't bring themselves to admit the truth. In 1009, the Vikings thought they'd conquered Vinland. But the Beothuk had other plans. And for once, just once, the invaders didn't win. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's forgotten Indigenous victories, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge the standard historical narrative. Next week, we're looking at another case of colonizers biting off more than they could chew. The disastrous French attempt to colonize Florida in 1565, and the Timucua people who made them regret it. Drop a comment and let me know. What other Indigenous resistance stories do you want to see covered on this channel? There are so many that deserve to be told.